Well, just yesterday we mentioned all we had left was to wait and observe how many sets of tuning we were going to get before the release of the patch. We said one was certain, and maybe we would have gotten a second one by next week, basically by the release of the patch, but not the release of the season. So we have our first change, which is relevant. It's relevant because it does change a few things, and to be precise, what it's actually changing is your hero talents of choice, because when it comes to DKs we have basically a switcheroo for both. When it comes to Frost, you see that Deathbringer gets another round of nerfs. You get Wave of Souls stacking Shadow Frost damage going from 5% to 3%. You have your stacking strength going from 10% to 5%. You have primary target damage of Wave of Souls cut in half from 100 to 5, and then exterminate damage is being nerfed in the first scythe being hit. On top of this, your base damage is nerfed by 3% and your obliterate damage is nerfed by 5%. The result of this is that the new 11.2 DK was a bit, you know, on the edge of choosing to play whether to play Rider and Deathbringer, as well as whether to play Frostbane, but this was more for Mythic Plus, less so for Raid, which was still definitely fit to play Breath. However, with these changes, this is a 4% nerf to both hero talents, of course, because this is for all the spec, so this is a 4% nerf. However, this is also a 4% nerf for Deathbringer and not a nerf for Rider. At the moment, Rider is your way to play in single target in the raid, basically for Frost DK, compared to what it was just until a few days ago, where Deathbringer was still the choice for DK. We can say the same thing for Unholy DK. However, this is a bit less drastic, because Unholy was already somewhat on the way from moving away from what they already are playing in Season 2, which is the Sun Lane spam of Death Coil and Vampiric Strike. You know, your very engaging Sun Lane gameplay, right? This was what you were doing in this season. This was already losing out after the several sets of buffs given by Blizzard to your pets, the so to speak called zoo build, your pet build while playing Rider, and going back to taking, of course, multiple of your pet-based talents, right? And what is happening to Unholy is very similar. You do have a Death Coil damage reduced by 20%, plus your stacking Death Coil damage in Essence of the Blood Queen, so for Sun Lane, is also cut in half, 4% per stack instead of 8% per stack. This is relevant, of course, for two reasons. Number one, your Death Coil already does significantly less damage than your Sun Lane Death Coil. So getting your Death Coil flat nerfed by 20% is already way more hurtful for Sun Lane than it is for Rider. And on top of this, you also nerf the Sun Lane part of your Death Coil damage increase, plus also, by the way, nerfing even more things, but these are less relevant for single target. This means that now these are the results. Now Sun Lane has fallen some comfortable 5-ish% DPS behind Rider when it comes to single target. You have this switcheroo now where you have Rider and Rider for both Unholy and Frost being the better hero talents at the moment. Not much worth of note down here. You do have a 2% parry nerf for Vengeance. Good, considering how powerful it is. It's always nice to nerf powerful specs. Very minor 1% more damage increase on Wildstalker on targets with Bloodseeker Vines, as well as very small damage increase, stacking damage increase per combo point for Feral from 3 to 5%. More nerf to the damage of Essence Bomb. It's a relevant one. We're gonna check this tomorrow when we go and take a look at the performance of the specs on the PTR in the keys in the PTR, where Devastation was one of the top specs in terms of damage, playing of course Flameshaper, which includes the damage of the Essence Bomb, which is now nerfed by 30%. Take number 72 of the nerfs of Hunter. We already went through a 8% Black Arrow nerf, followed by a blanket 10% damage nerf to Marksmanship, also continued by a Sentinel nerf, which reduced the bonus aim shot damage from 30% down to 20%. Now you get another 8% damage nerf to Black Arrow, and another 10% damage nerf to your aim shot, from 30 to 20 to 10% inside of your Lunar Storm buff and your next two aim shots once Lunar Storm ends, all reduced down to 10% more damage. Plus, even more hurtingly, very big, your splash ricochet to 5 extra targets with your aim shot and rapid fire is now no longer 75% of the original damage, it's only 60% of the original damage. This is a quite a neutral nerf to both the Dark Ranger and the Sentinel versions of Hunter, which were topping the meters in Mythic Plus regardless of the build, you know, facing one of the other best specs. For example, in Mythic Plus, you are playing Black Arrow, you're still first. Again, you play another one of the good ones, and this time you play Sentinel, you're still first. Their damage, especially burst damage, was very high. So having your ricochet nerfed by 15% and your damage inside of Lunar Storm nerfed by another 10% is quite big, because this is basically your burst in the pool. So you have Lunar Storm from here all the way up to basically here, plus your next two hits of aim shots are still empowered after Lunar Storm ends, because your tier set, your Hunter tier set, when you play Sentinel, you have the buff active for the entire duration of Lunar Storm, but then also when Lunar Storm fades, you still have the buff active on your next two aim shots. So now this has nerfed down to 10% damage increase. But you can see that even then you had a comfortable 60 million DPS, and even then you can see that compared to the other ones in your group, yeah, you were doing quite a lot of damage. So now you're getting a 15% nerf of trick shots in here to this damage, and technically this damage as well. So we are talking about like an 8% damage nerf, and then also 10% reduced damage on aim shot from your tier set, which is another almost 5% damage nerf. So in AoE, this is quite big for Sentinel, but for Dark Ranger is somewhat similar, because you don't get the 10% damage nerf to aim shot, but you do get the 8% damage nerf to Black Arrow. So even when we go and look at a very similar, basically burst pull window or whatever, from 2 minutes to 1:35, like 30-second burst, it's a 37 million DPS, and this is now what gets nerfed by 8%, which is a 4% nerf. Plus the 15% trick shots nerf of aim shot, which is, you know, 7.5 plus 4, you know, it's a very similar nerf to both the hero talents of Marksmanship. And then for good measure, why not, Beast Mastery also gets a 3% damage nerf. Mages still get some tuning, although this time it's mostly ignorable, you know. Meteorite damage reduced by 15%, the AoE of Arcane Phoenix, which was very minor, reduced by 10%, your resonance bonus damage for Arcane is down by 3%, the only relevant one is Fire getting 3% less damage, and Flame Strike damage reduced as well. We touched on this possibly becoming relevant when Blizzard nerfed only Ignite without nerfing Flame Strike. This is what can happen, of course, because mages always have the option to either play in Mythic Plus by spamming Pyro and then spreading the Ignite damage built by the Pyro as a way to do AoE. The other way to do AoE is to just use Flame Strike. So if you nerf Ignite without nerfing Flame Strike, it means mages can just ignore Flame Strike and play the Pyro Ignite spreading build. Instead, now they also nerf the other way to do AoE for fire mages by nerfing directly the Flame Strike itself. So, I mean, the good thing is that you can still play the Pyro spreading build anyways when you are playing some Fury, and you can just go Frostfire and not play Flame Strike, because Frostfire doesn't bother playing with Flame Strike anyways. After Mage, we have the very curious case of Monks, because while the first nerf is okay, Mistweaver gets their 4-piece set bonus to give you 5% less haste. This is okay, simply because your tier set as Mistweaver was giving you 15% haste when you got your heart buff, and the 2-piece gave you your heart buff also when you use Thunder Focus Tea. So you will be able to do Thunder Focus Tea, spec into Secret Infusion to use Renewing Mist, so you get 15% haste from Secret Infusion, another 15% haste from your 4-piece, and that's a 30% haste for 10 seconds every 30 seconds, which basically means you get a Bloodlust. Every 30 seconds you get 10 seconds of Bloodlust, which is huge. Even more so on a spec that already stacks haste. You would get to like 95% haste every 30 seconds, which is insane. You would even easily cap your GCD. You were casting even too fast for your own good. So getting nerfed by 5% there is okay. It's a completely acceptable nerf. What is way more weird is the Windwalker nerf. Don't get misled by the fact that you get 8% more damage as a compensation. This is much bigger than that. This is because the CDR value you would get from Heart of the Jade Serpent as a Windwalker is much more valuable than the CDR value you get as Mistweaver. Mistweaver doesn't really get that many important cooldowns back, but Windwalker is all about being able to cycle your Fists of Fury, your Rising Sun Kick, your Strike of the Windlord, your Whirling Dragon Punch, so being able to get them down to be 75% faster in their cooldown recovery was extremely good. Your tier set already stacked multiplicatively with your already existing Heart of the Jade Serpent, so you could use Strike of the Windlord to proc this, and then you could go and use your Slicing Winds to then proc this again and stack it multiplicatively, all of these effects, with your already original Heart proc. And this also worked in the case of Windwalker, not even just with the CDR of your abilities, but even things like the channel time of your Fists of Fury would also turn it into a near instant ability because of how faster you were channeling this, for example, which is extremely good. So all of these effects could stack together, both the 15% haste of your tier set during Heart of the Jade Serpent, the other tinier buff for 4 seconds after, that was also 15% haste, procced by both your Slicing Winds from your tier set and by your default hero talent procced by Strike of the Windlord. This was super good. It was reducing your cooldowns at an extremely fast rate, giving you the 50% faster Fist of Fury channel as well. Tons of damage. So you were expecting, if this was being nerfed, you were expecting some kind of a compensation, which you received here. But to compensate for this kind of damage, the damage buff was supposed to be in the 20% range. If you wanted to stay even and not lose any damage, it should have been a 15% buff at the very minimum. Instead, it's an 8% buff, which means effectively you are nerfed by 7% with this change. This is problematic because Windwalker was not doing too well. Windwalker was in fact the definition of basically average. So with this nerf now, you are down to being just above tanks, especially when you consider this was buffed, this was buffed, this was buffed, this was buffed by quite a bit. So now you are losing, on top of being nerfed by 7%, you're also losing out to all of the other specs that have been buffed. So basically you are down to doing very bad now with this buff. We assume by the next week this will be adjusted to be like 12% more or something like that, because right now the nerf to their tier set, which was already extremely more powerful than the Shadowpan competition, it's not even a debate. It's not that you can say, oh well, you just don't play this, you just go play Shadowpan. No, you can't as a Windwalker. So this will have to be increased by way more. What wasn't that good either was Holy Paladin. This time Holy Paladin does get some attention. Now initially it is a bit misleading because you start reading the notes and immediately bam, Sun's avatar healing reduced by 40%. So it's like a 2.5% nerf, just like that. What follows the nerfs though are your single target, Word of Glory, now Eternal Flame when you play Herald, buffed by 15%. You have your 2-piece giving you 30% more Dawn Light healing. You have your 4-piece, which is active about a third of the time in a fight. Now empowers your spender by 30% instead of 15%, and even better, Second Sunrise, which is this thing right here, giving you a 15% chance to double cast Light of Dawn and double cast Holy Shock for 30% of their value. Now instead, it's a guaranteed chance to double cast them at only 15% effectiveness. Is it still good? Because now basically it means that these two are always doing 15% more, because they always double cast, which is very good. And on top of that, you can get some values by double casting. Now, it's not at this exact moment available on the PTR, but logically, double casting should give you more chances, for example, to proc Infusion of Light, because the free double cast of Holy Shock can crit, and you can gain Infusion of Light. The free double cast of Holy Shock can also give you back mana, thanks to Reclamation, for example. Possibly the free double cast of Light of Dawn can help you trigger Divine Purpose, for example. So you also have values in double casting things more often. The idea basically from this is to not make you nearly as dependent on Sun's Avatar and the splash healing of Dawnlight. Basically, not to make you nearly as dependent on having your group clamped up together for the beams of Sun's Avatar and the splash healing of Dawnlight to have max effectiveness only if you're grouped. So they are nerfing the value of this basically grouped healing with Sun's Avatar and then buffing a bunch of other things, especially Holy Shock, Eternal Flame, and Light of Dawn. You are now even better at spot healing. Your spot healing is even stronger, and your spenders are also even stronger. It's like a 6-ish% overall healing buff for Holy Paladin, which is very good, because they were here. Holy Paladin wasn't doing very well in the PTR, right, in the testing, so it's also a necessary kind of buff for Holy. Last time for Ret we touched on them, we talked about single target. Templar's Verdict obviously was a single target buff, Divine Arbiter, Judgment, the initial hit of Blade of Justice, Crusading Strikes, Hyler's Judgment, Empyrean Hammer. All of this was single target, with some exception, of course, like Empyrean Hammer, right, doing also some AoE damage, obviously. And now you have the second set of buffs, which is AoE focused. Divine Storm, Wake of Ashes, Truth's Wake, so all AoE features of your toolkit buffed by a bunch. It's like a 3% AoE damage increase from these numbers for Ret Paladin. We don't have to talk about the mana discount on your Holy Nova. We can talk about finally some patch notes for rogues. First, because of the quality of life fix of Cold Blood that now goes on cooldown immediately. Even if you hold it and don't use it, the cooldown starts already, which is very good for Assassination. Doubled up QOL for Assassination by fixing the problem of Kingsbane's ramping damage resetting while Kingsbane was already active with the 2-piece equipped, because the 2-piece was extending the duration of Kingsbane, but also by extending this was also like resetting the ramp damage of Kingsbane. This by itself is like a 3.5% damage buff just with this hotfix, plus the all damage increase by 4% for Assassination, plus, more importantly, not this, which is whatever because that Stalker is very weak, but rather this 17% damage increase for your Tails and Lucky Coin damage. So this would be in total a 12% damage buff to Assassination, as they also move permanently basically to Fatebound. A move to Fatebound will be the same fate pun of Outlaw. 3.5% damage buff plus Killing Spree buff, and again the only thing that matters here is the 70% damage buff for Fatebound. Now Fatebound is up to 10% stronger in single target than Trickster. Trickster does have its possible uses in AoE, even though this just got nerfed for Trickster, but this buff might be so big that you might even end up playing Fatebound in AoE anyways for Outlaw. The more evened out set of buffs goes to Sub. They do get a 5% damage buff, but they do get, weirdly enough, their Sub tier set nerfed. This was buff for Assassination, but this was in reverse for Sub. Assa goes from 50 to 60, Sub goes from 50 to 40, which was weird since that Stalker wasn't a particularly strong tier set anyways. Actually very big burst buff depending on how this will work. Now Nimble Flurry will also scale with Shadow Blades. We're not sure if this is a 20% flat buff or additive buff, so if the percent ability damage dealt by Nimble Flurry in Shadow Blades goes up by 20%, meaning 72%, or 20% meaning 80%. Either way, it's still a buff. But this was mostly, of course, for AoE. The single target one is smaller overall compared to both Outlaw and Assa because of how much Fatebound is getting buffed. Now, not that we're talking about some insane specs, it's not that when you're talking about, for example, pure single target testing, these specs were doing particularly well. So even a 12% buff to Assa, for example, would put them around here. So in the good range in terms of specs being buffed for damage, for single target damage. The more weird change is also our last one, is to Warlock and to Destruction in particular, because right now Warlock in the raid in single target is playing Diabolist after Diabolist received many buffs a couple of weeks ago. The confusing part is, okay, if Warlock is playing Diabolist, why are we nerfing Hellcaller? So Blizzard is buffing Chaos Bolt, so it's buffing the base Destro value, the base single target power, while nerfing Hellcaller. This logically would point towards a Mythic Plus change, because in Mythic Plus Hellcaller is way more viable. So the idea is, I guess, to try to make Diabolist more even with Hellcaller in Mythic Plus, which is still not the answer. Hellcaller is still stronger in AoE than Diabolist anyways, even after these nerfs, which then makes you wonder, but now Hellcaller is even worse in single target though, because you nerf them anyways, even if you were trying to make Diabolist stronger in Mythic Plus by nerfing Hellcaller, what you manage to get is just an even weaker Hellcaller version of Destro for single target with these nerfs, because Wither and Black and Soul are still a significant part of your single target damage. So it's a weird way to go at changing the hero talents. If you wanted the Diabolist to be stronger in AoE, you could have just buffed the AoE portion, the AoE damage of Diabolist, instead of trying to nerf Hellcaller, which wasn't doing particularly well right now. In fact, Destro as a whole hadn't been doing particularly well in the PTR. If there was one spec that had been doing very well overall in the PTR, was Demo, and definitely not Destro. So this was a pretty confusing set of changes for Warlock, for Destro. But that being said, this is all that we have in this yet another round of PTR tuning. We can still be quite happy about the fact that in 27 days from the 30th to the 3rd of July we have gotten 6 sets of tuning. So 6 balanced tuning passes in 23 days, one every 3.5 days basically. It's quite a good space, to be fair, for changes. So very nice sets of changes. Of course, now even better now that we have this last week in the PTR with all of the Mythic Plus keys being testable, plus all of our gear upped in item level from 710 to the end game, end of season power of 723 item level. So now we get to see the max power of these specs after they have been changed by these sets of balance tuning. So we get to now test and check out the current power of the specs even better after these changes. So with this said and done on this Thursday, what is left to do obviously is observe how these specs will now be performing before the release of the season. But for today, we can now leave each other. We're starting the goodbyes as usual by thanking everyone for having watched the video, together with of course everyone else who's been supporting completely for free by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, I don't mind it. It's a bit weird, honestly, to go through July into August with like 25 degrees, nice temperature and whatnot. Still, I'll perfectly take it.